So we're actually going to talk about speech and communication, even though we're here to talk about thoughts, but speech is just as important. And the ability to communicate is very important as well. Communication is a very hot topic in business, in personal life, in relationships, in pretty much about anything. Communication is a crucial element of our being. Why? Because the only way we could accomplish something other than what's within ourselves is to communicate. If you think about it, your name, the only reason why you have a name is for communication purposes. Otherwise, why would you need a name? So communication is a core element of who we are as a person, or who you are as a person, who I am as a person. But the ability to communicate comes from thought, more than we know. In other words, our style of communication, our ability to communicate is a product of our thoughts. And we're going to take a look at something that happened in a conversation between Moshe and Hashem to drill down the communication aspect that Hashem was trying to convey to Moshe. So there's a brief conversation in this week's parsha, in this week's Torah portion. It's up on the screen in text 1a. And what does Hashem say? Hashem says, "Come, speak to Paro." It doesn't say go, speak to Paro. It says, "Come, speak to Paro, and tell him to let the children of Israel go." But Moshe was nervous because he said something that is brought up in last week's parsha, as we're going to see. But he uses the words "Ani arel sfasayim." I am of closed lips. I have a speech impediment, a speech disability. He brought this up last week's Torah portion as well. But Moshe was obviously very self-conscious about his ability to speak, and he was wondering how Hashem expected him to communicate the message to Paro if he didn't even know how to speak. He couldn't speak, or at least his speech was very hard to hear or hard to be understood by somebody, which is the most important part of communication. You can talk and talk all day, but if people don't understand you, if other people aren't able to relate to what you're saying, it's not really very helpful. So that's what Moshe's response to Hashem telling him to go speak to Paro is, which is interesting because he had a very similar exchange last week's Torah portion. Let's take a look. This is from last week. One second. This is still from this week. This is still from this week's parsha, but we're going to go back in a second and we're going to see what last week's parsha's conversation was. So Hashem says to Moshe, saying, "I am Hashem," in other words, giving him the introduction. Speak to Paro what I tell you. And Moshe says, "Hashem, I am Ani arel sfasayim." So how will Paro understand me? How will he listen to me if he can't understand what I'm saying? And Hashem says to Moshe, "Wait a second. I made you Lord." In other words, I made you superior to Paro, and Aaron, your brother, will be your translator, will be your spokesperson. In other words, Hashem is reiterating that you will speak all that I command you, and Aaron, your brother, will speak to Paro, and he will tell Paro the message that you want to tell him. Great. That sounds very civil. But if you look at last week's parsha, it's very, one second. If you look at last week's parsha, it's a very different kind of conversation. So first, let's look at Rashi of this week's. Rashi says that once every message, in other words, what does it mean that you will speak and Aaron will translate? Is once every message, as you have heard it from my mouth, Hashem is saying, Aaron, your brother, will interpret it, will translate it, and explain it to Paro in a way that he understands. Fine. But let's go to last week. Last week was very similar, but a little bit harsher on Hashem's side. Remember, this is what happened previously to what we just read. Moshe says to Hashem, I'm not a man of words. How often were you asked, I'm talking to you specifically or to anyone listening or to myself, how often are we asked or you asked to speak or to say something or to explain something, and you're like, it's not really my thing. I'm not really up for that. I'm not a man of words. I'm not a person of words. I'm not a good speaker. It's not really my style, my thing, or whatever the excuse. So Moshe gave that very same excuse and said, I am not a man of words. I guess he was still referring to the fact that he has a speech impediment, but he was saying in more of a general term. So what did Hashem say? This is Hashem's response. I'm going to read it in Hebrew because it's a little more powerful, but this is verse 11, Yud Aleph. Hashem said to him, Mi sam pela adam. Who made you a person? Who gave you the disability in the first place? I gave it to you. Which, let's stop there for a second. It's pretty powerful. Moshe is telling Hashem, I have this speech impediment. I have a speech disability, and therefore I cannot communicate what you're telling me to Paro, or I'm going to have a hard time to do that. And Hashem's like, who do you think gave it to you in the first place? Who gave you the ability to speak? Who took away your ability to speak? That was me, God. And who does that to anybody? Who creates disability in the first place? This is an important message because when it comes to disability, we're obviously referring to challenges, things that what we think prevent us from being our true selves or achieving success. Let's say it's ADHD, or let's say it's illness, or let's say it's depression, or whatever the challenge might be going through. And I'm talking broad range, broad stroke. I'm not targeting a specific thing. The bottom line is that there's a challenge that prevents us from achieving our goals. It's a disability to some extent. And Hashem is sort of reiterating to Moshe that I'm the one who gave you that disability. I'm the one who created that challenge in the first place. And the pasuk goes on. Hashem was angry at Moshe and says, "Don't you have a brother? I'm sure he'll be your spokesman. He'll speak for you." This is last week's parsha, remember. And he will speak for you to the people, and it will be he that he will be able to be through him as your spokesperson, you'll be able to be the leader. That's a pretty harsh rebuke to Moshe that Hashem is giving. And who do you think gave you the disability in the first place? And you have a brother who could speak for you. And basically, the Torah says that Hashem was angry. Now let us go to what we just read in this week's Torah portion. Moshe has the audacity. 1 second, sorry, my mouse is not really cooperating here. Here. Moshe has the audacity to say, I have a speech impediment, even after Hashem rebukes him. In last week's parsha, it says, I have a speech impediment. How am I going to speak to Paro? But this time Hashem answers very differently and says that, see how I have made you a lord over Paro, and Aaron, your brother, will be your spokesperson. He didn't get angry this time. So what's the difference between last week's parsha and this week's parsha? That Moshe complained about his speech ability, impediment or speech disability or whatever it was that was preventing him from communicating. And why in this week's parsha is Hashem much more understanding and much more calm in his answer to Moshe without any, and also, where does Moshe get the guts to bring it up again if it was already sort of like silenced last week? So there's a lot of questions on these two conversations that Moshe has with Hashem. And it's on these two conversations that we're obviously going to be building our lesson from. So let us go back to the situation in the first place. I want to make sure I didn't skip any here. 1 second, sorry. So what was being asked of Moshe? Something not easy. He was being asked to go to the dictator of the world, to the king of the superpower, and to tell him something that he obviously doesn't want to hear. So it's a very risky task. It's something that Moshe is obviously afraid to do, or at least he communicates that. And he uses a speech impediment, or he mentions his speech impediment as a potential reason for his fear. But now we have to understand, what is the root cause of Moshe's conversation? The fact that he wanted to bring it up again as a challenge and asking Hashem to respond to that. So let's understand this for a second, what this speech impediment is and what's the real source behind the speech impediment. Just as a backstory, and I think we mentioned this a few weeks ago, but as a backstory, the Medrash tells us how Moshe got the speech impediment. That after the daughter or the princess of Egypt rescued Moshe, brought him to the palace. So Paro was nervous because his magicians, his astrologers all told him that there's a Hebrew boy that's going to be born and is going to rescue the Israelites. So Paro told his daughter, I'm going to make you a deal. We're going to put a pot of gold in front of him, and we'll put a pot of hot burning coal. And if he chooses the gold, it means that he's a typical power-hungry human that's going to eventually overthrow me, and therefore he has to be killed. So Moshe, being the baby at the time, literally an infant, and these two pots were placed in front of him, he obviously went for the gold. And it says an angel came and pushed Moshe's hand into the coal to save his life, but his hand was burning. So he put his hand in his mouth, which burnt his mouth and prevented him from having a normal ability to speak. But there's a deeper essence to this speech impediment, because if Moshe was the one who's basically tasked and born with this mission of giving the Torah to the children of Israel, and being the one that we refer to Torah's Moshe, the 5 books of Moses, this is Moshe's ultimate communication. Not only that, but every single aspect of the Torah that is that is mentioned or brought up as a commentary or as a lesson or halacha or Jewish law is all said to be given and transferred from Moshe down at Mount Sinai, which means Moshe had to be a communicator. So what does it really mean that he had this speech impediment? Okay. So the Rebbe starts by giving us a little bit of an understanding of what it means to be. Let's read the text and we'll unpack it afterwards. So Rashi translates, what does it mean, Ani Arel Sfasayim? I am like heavy of mouth, or I have a heavy mouth, and heavy tongue as I speak with difficulty. In other words, Moshe was able to talk, but it came with difficulty. By contrast, closed lips is a complete obstruction of speech. So there's two different complaints that Moshe had. In last week's Torah portion, I'm sorry, let me just quickly see which Torah, which I forgot if the heavy speech was in this week's or. So Ani Arel Sfasayim was this week's, and I am of closed lips, and last week's was I have a heavy speech. So the Rebbe is saying here that there's a difference between those two types of disability. One is that when you have a heavy speech or a heavy mouth, a heavy tongue, it means that you could speak, but it's very difficult. Ani Arel Sfasayim, but if I have closed lips, means that I cannot speak at all. So it's a different disability. Two different disabilities that Moshe was complaining about. And that's why Moshe added in his claim before in this week's parsha, before Moshe assumed that he was just heavy of mouth and tongue, at least he could speak, but albeit it was difficult. It was with difficulty. To that end, taking Aaron along was enough, as he would be able to expand and explain whatever Moshe said cryptically to Paro. So that was last week, is when Moshe stressed that I could still speak, but it's going to be very hard for anyone to understand me. So Aaron was a solution because Aaron was able to at least communicate, translate, and understand and communicate that to Paro. But this week, Moshe is saying something different. He's saying, I can't speak at all, so Aaron's not going to be able to help me. In other words, speech is completely impossible, so having a translator, there'll be nothing to translate. There'll be nothing to communicate because I'm not able to even speak. Why is this Torah portion, or why is this disability so different? Or why is Moshe sort of changing his disability last week from being heavy speech to this week being impossible to speak? So the answer comes at the core of the mission of what Moshe was tasked to do. So I'm not going to follow the text exactly here because I want to set the stage for the thought process. Imagine you're about to go through a specific procedure of surgery, or let's say you're about to get on a space shuttle, or let's say you're about to go skydiving. Think of any scary or dangerous activity, and the procedure or surgery is still a legit possibility because it's difficult. So what's your first question that you usually have in your mind? What's the survival rate, right? Whether it's a procedure in the hospital, or whether it's skydiving, or whether it's flying on a spaceship, or whether it's whatever dangerous activity you're going to do, you're always going to look at the statistic. Not going to look at the statistics, but you're going to wonder what is the natural historical evidence that I will be able to come out of this alive and hopefully uninjured. That's a very valid question. If you go through a procedure, well, how often has this doctor done this procedure? Is this something that is survivable? And is it something that has been, worked on and done? Before you get a medicine, before you get a vaccine, you always want to know, what have the tests said? What are the results? And all these are all legitimate questions, and not just in health, but also in activities that we undertake. In Egypt, we have to realize that there was never a possibility of freedom for a slave. Once you were enslaved, once you were in a situation with the superpower being your captors and your slave owners, it was impossible to even think for freedom because it was never an option. It was never a reality for anyone. It says that there was never a slave that escaped Egypt. It doesn't mean that you couldn't escape the land. It means that there was never a real opportunity for freedom for somebody who was once enslaved. Whether that was a mindset, whether that was the reality of the difficulty of Egypt. Egypt was a superpower. They were basically in charge of the whole world. Nobody wanted to mess with them. So if you belonged to them, you were their property, you were pretty much doomed. Moshe was being asked to challenge this status quo that had never been challenged before. So when Hashem told him to go talk to the people or talk to Paro and just, get the ball rolling, so Moshe first was nervous. He said, listen, I could say it, but I don't know, like, what, will the people believe me? Will Paro even want to listen to me? Now you're starting to get specific. You want him to release the people now or today or without any more. You're basically asking me to go completely against nature. You're asking me to do something that has no statistical success, has never had statistical success. So as a human, what happens naturally to us as a human is that we freeze up because we're now basically going into uncharted territory. Imagine being the first one on a space shuttle that never ever was tested. Or imagine being the first one to do an activity or to go through a procedure that had never been tried before. It's some people are very risk, but they understand that there's a risk associated with it. Here, it wasn't about Moshe's survival. It was about Moshe's chances of success. That how am I going to do this? There's thousands and thousands of people that are depending on me, that Hashem is putting in my hands for success. But if I don't do it right, or if I don't succeed, I'm basically letting them down. And it's never happened that someone succeeded. So Moshe was in a tough spot, which is why the first initial hesitation, I can't do this. I have a heavy mouth, I have a heavy tongue. It's going to be hard to say the words. And then Moshe was like, I can't speak at all. I have closed lips. So what's Hashem's response? How does Hashem respond to that? The first time when Moshe was hesitant, saying that my speech is difficult, I can still speak, but it's going to be difficult. So Hashem's response is, who do you think gave you that in the first place? Who do you think gave you that challenge? And we're going to go back there in a second. But this time, Moshe's challenge was a whole different one. It was a whole different type of challenge. It was like you're asking me to do something that has never been accomplished and never been succeeded. And Hashem's response here is that I have made you a lord over Paro. Is that now that you are my messenger, I am the one that gave you the ability to succeed here. Hashem is telling Moshe, you are not bound by the laws of nature. So just because it hasn't happened naturally does not mean it's not going to happen. Let's break that down a little bit and through some more levels of vision. So let's skip this one here. So we're going to go to another commentary, another medrash here. And he says that Hashem told Moshe, you shall not add anything of your own. Rather, you shall say my words exactly as I deliver them to you, and you will certainly receive aid from on high. So this is a bit Kabbalistic as well, because basically, if you decide to become your own spokesperson, if you decide to do things in your own way, then I can't promise you the results anymore, because at that point you're just talking for Moshe. But as long as you tell Paro exactly what I tell you to do, you're not going to be operating on a human being operating system. You're going to be working with a supernatural, spiritual, godly, transcendent ability that you're going to break through whatever challenges you might encounter. Okay, now let's go back a second, and we're going to have a little hint to where the disconnect is. So Paro, it says that Paro, the Pharaoh in general, not just one specific king, but the Pharaoh would sit on a throne that had 70 steps up to the top. And each step was represented a different nation or a different language. And Paro would quiz the person who was coming up the steps on if they spoke the language, and only if they knew all 70 languages would they be able to rise to the top. Yosef, when he was called from prison to appear before Paro, according to some who was a different king. So Yosef was taught by Elijah the prophet every single language until he got to the 70th step. But Yosef revealed that he actually knows another language that Paro didn't know, and that was Hebrew. And Paro wanted to learn it, but Yosef tried to teach it, but it wasn't possible. He wasn't able to absorb it. So Paro made him swear that he will not reveal that I don't know this language of Hebrew, of Lashon Kodesh, not the modern Hebrew, but Lashon Kodesh. Now, Rashi references this actually when Yosef wanted to bury his father Yaakov. So Rashi says that Yosef had to say, I swore to my father that I'm going to bury him in Israel. And Rashi points out that what Yosef was hinting to Paro is that you made me swear I will never reveal that you don't know the language. There's a language that I know above you. So just like you want me to keep my oath, then I have to keep my other oath to my father as well. So it's obviously something that's accepted by the sages that Yosef tried to teach him Hebrew, but Paro wasn't able to absorb it. That being said, why wasn't Paro, if he knew 70 languages, he was obviously a linguist, he was good with languages, why couldn't he understand Hebrew? What was so complicated about Lashon Kodesh? And the answer is because the concept or the soul of Lashon Kodesh means that you're accepting on a yoke above you that is beyond your existence. In other words, you're connecting yourself to something higher that is higher than you. The Egyptians at the time, they worshipped their own existence. So the idea that you can understand a language that is transcendent of your own self, your own natural, your own existence was impossible. And that is where the godliness or the spirituality and the superseding the natural order comes into play, and the Egyptians were not able to handle that. So now let's go back to Moshe. So what does it mean in this week's parsha when Hashem says, I made you the Lord over Paro? So Rashi brings one measure that says in order to bring about the plagues and bring about the punishments and the judgments and all that stuff. But there's something a little bit deeper about this, because Hashem is telling him as a preparation before he goes and fulfills his mission, more as a vote of confidence that I have given you. You got this. I'm giving you the ability to be godly when you go speak to Paro. So the Rebbe explains Moshe's role in speaking to Paro was not about explaining anything. That was Aaron's role. And that's why in last week's Torah portion we dealt with that. When he said I have difficulty, because he could speak, it just was very hard. So Aaron was the translator. And Hashem was angry with Moshe for using his disability as a reason that he's not going to fulfill his mission. Saying, I gave you that disability because that's what makes you who you are, but I'm giving you the antidote, I'm giving you the source, or I'm giving you the ability to overcome that with your brother Aaron. So don't use that as a reason to get out of this. But this week's parsha, Moshe is now being asked to overcome and overthrow. This is where the beginning of the mission, of the actual work begins. And he's Moshe and Paro is the king. And that's why Hashem empowers him by saying, I gave you as a Lord over him. That his job was to break Paro's natural order, to break the way the world was running, to break the status quo, to stop the natural flow of things that made it impossible for a slave to escape. That had nothing to do with speaking. It had everything to do with bringing the supernatural into the natural. So the Rebbe continues. This explains our topic of discussion. Moshe's talk was to tell Paro, let my people go, with the brazenness and anger that would intimidate Paro with a sheer force of speech, as well as Moshe's body language, such as his face, and let him understand that this was no laughing matter. Plagues and suffering were coming. To sum it up, we all know that the voice of speech is only a part of the communication. Body language is a very important part. Your attitude, your movements, your presentation are all very important when it comes to communication. So Moshe wasn't bringing up, my lips don't move. In other words, I cannot speak because you're asking me to break Paro through a full force of communication, and I don't have that. You want me to say certain words, I'll say the certain words. You want me to tell him XYZ, you want me to tell people XYZ, that's fine. But you're asking me to break him. You're asking me to break nature, and I'm not God. And that's why Hashem tells him, I made you Samti Elokim al Paro, I made you a lord over Paro, in a sense that you are now not ruled by the laws of nature. And you were able to break that. So here comes the question. How come Hashem couldn't tell Moshe that last week? Last week, Moshe said, I have a disability where it makes it very hard for me to speak. And therefore, how am I going to say these words to Paro? And Hashem gets angry at him, saying, how dare you? I'm the one who created you. I'm the one who gave you the power to speak. And I'm the one who gave you the disability to challenge you and make you into who you are. And I'm the one who's giving you the ability to overcome your disabilities through your brother Aaron. Why can't Hashem just say, I made you a lord over Paro? You're now supernatural. If you're supernatural, your disability doesn't matter. How come to this week's antidote or this week's response can't be the response for both? And this is where our personal lesson comes into play. And I'm going to first elaborate a little bit on it verbally, and then we'll go into the text. But there's a process. There's a process when it comes to overcoming our own negative thoughts. There's a process in how we communicate ourselves, in other words, to ourselves in our relationships, or communicate in business, or communicate in general, in life, in our speech, or whatever it is that we're trying to communicate. The first step of the process has to be our understanding and recognition that nothing can stop us. There's no disability that can stop us. And stop making excuses. We all have challenges. Everybody has their own packages, as they say. Not justifying any challenges that people face, not making it okay, but not letting it be a reason for not fulfilling our mission in this world. It cannot be the excuse. That's the first thing. Because if we don't do that, then we can't even we can't even have a conversation. We can't even. Unfortunately, I will tell you that I've had conversations with people where they're so their self-image is so bad that you can't even have a conversation with them about moving forward, because they're so wound up in their own minds as to where they stand in the world and to their own eyes, to other people, that you can't even, they're so wound up in it that they can't get out of that circle of loathing. It's very sad when you see that, because at least it requires a much more professional approach to overcome. But for most of us, thank God, it's more of a daily annoyance where you have this feeling, or this negativity, or this rut, or whatever it might be, that tries to pull you down, or say that, oh, you messed up on this one, or you're going to fail on that one. And we have to just shut that voice up. And we have to be able to we're not using supernatural powers yet. We're first letting ourselves know that God created the world. God gave us our existence of who we are. God gave us the challenges, and that's why Hashem said, Boy, El Pari, come to Paro, I'm there too. I'm part of the problem. I'm the challenge. Not some external challenge that you're going up against. I am the bad guy too. I'm the good guy and the bad guy. This is all part of an obstacle course that I created for you. So there's no backing out of it. Or there's no saying, oh, that's too bad. I don't do that. This is built for you. That's the first approach and attitude we have to have. And when we try to get out of this one, Hashem gets angry at us, because this is why we're created. We can't start throwing excuses as to why we're not willing to get out of bed and do what we have to do. This is what we're created for. So that's the first step as a human being. But then comes, once we're already up, we already decided we're going to go for it. We already decided our disability is not going to challenge us, and are not going to hold us back. We already decided we're going out in the world, and we're going to make waves, and we're going to do what we have to do, and we're going to use whatever resources we can find to succeed. Great. But then we come across a challenge sometimes so great that there's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no possibility of success that we can even imagine. It's never happened before. We come to a point where things are so dire, or so difficult, or so hard to even understand, that we're like, well, where does this end? Where could this take us? How could we even get out of this? How can I get out of this? And that's where there's a different response required. And that's where Hashem says that you're not anymore operating on your own operating system. This is where you draw in that essence of your soul that is basically God. And as long as you do what God says, and as long as you make yourself a vessel for Hashem, you are going to overcome the natural way of the world with a supernatural element. And let's see how that works. So here's the natural element. Ad akshav, until now, no slave has ever been able to escape from Egypt, because the border of the land was locked. In other words, there are many explanations to this, but it means that there were a few aspects. First of all, physically they were the superpower. So even though there were other nations of the world at the time, they were all subservient to Egypt. So wherever you would run to, if Egypt wanted to bring you back, the other nations had to comply. That's one simple way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it is that the slavery was so intense, the mindset was so intense, that your mindset was unable to shift to becoming a free person. And that's the idea that the doors were locked. In other words, it was closed off from this person ever becoming from slave to a free person. That's the natural order that was unbreakable. So now let's get a little Kabbalistic, because this is really the source to the this is really the explanation to how the supernatural works. And I'm gonna get a little bit it's gonna be a little bit deep, but just bear with me here. So there's two worlds. Okay. When God created the world, he first introduced a concept called Tohu. Tohu means chaos. Why was this world chaos? Because God revealed even though he created, even before any creation, God is just pure infinite light. There's no levels, there's no characteristics, there's no pseudo, nothing. It's just pure godliness. There's pure God's essence to beyond our human comprehension. God clears out what's called the Makam Pana, empty space, which even though he's still fully there, because God is everywhere, but he makes it appear as if he's not, so there could be an independency. And within this empty space is the vessels of the world. In other words, the idea that there could be independency is vessels. So for example, if you want to drink, you cannot have the drink without a cup, because unless the liquid is conditioned to pour straight into your mouth, you have to get a glass or a cup or whatever it is the liquid goes into. So the idea of a vessel in a spiritual sense means that there's something that feels external and independent that could absorb the godly energy in order to exist and still be independent. Right? So if you pour a boiling hot drink into a very, very thin paper cup, the cup's not going to be able to hold it, and the hot drink's going to go everywhere because the cup is just not built to hold a hot drink. So the vessel has to be perfect in a sense that the light of God that is going to go into the vessel has to be able to absorb that light and still remain a vessel in order for it to be an independent being. If the vessel cannot withstand or cannot survive the revelation of godly light within it, it's not going to be a vessel anymore. It's going to absorb itself in God's energy. Why does it say that if a person sees God, they have to die? It says in later on, in a few portions down, when Moshe wanted to see God, it says that Hashem says to Moshe that a soul cannot see me and live, because the soul, as soon as it sees God, it can't be in the vessel anymore. The vessel disintegrates because the light is so powerful, and therefore there's no vessel anymore. That the vessel reveals itself as being a part of God too, and therefore there's no independency. So when God created the world of Tohu, in other words, that first quote unquote attempt, even though it was on purpose, of creation, God made the vessels very weak and made the light very strong, like pouring hot water into a paper cup. And the water burst. In other words, the light of God's revelation burst the vessels. And it says that the sparks of Tohu fell into what's called Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. And that light, which is basically a very high revelation, fell into what we know today as materialism and also in some cases evil. So how do bad people exist? How do bad things happen? How is there evil? They're all from what's called sparks of Tohu. They're in existence because they're kept in existence. They're kept in existence by the sparks of Tohu, which basically are very powerful, but they're not encompassed with a vessel, and therefore they have the ability to manifest in basically anything. Then the world that we live in is called Tikkun. The world Tikkun means the rectification, in which we are basically elevating and reconnecting and uniting the sparks of Tohu with their source. So every mitzvah that we do with something material and physical, we reconnect the spark that's within it, which is originally a spark of Tohu, and we reignite it and reconnect it with godliness in a modified way that is actually sustainable. That's the idea of Tikkun, is that it's sustainable. Is that it's basically the vessels are able to handle the light. It's a lot less light and a lot stronger vessels. So a tzaddik, a righteous person, who is also a blinding energy of God, but because the vessels are able to withstand, able to hold it, so a tzaddik, a righteous person, is living in a world of tikkun. Because what they're basically doing is bringing godliness into the world in a controlled way, in a sense that it's not going to overpower the vessels, And therefore the tzaddik is able to exist and is able to live within a physical world and unite the godliness and the materialism in a way that the vessels and the light of God are able to coexist and and the vessels don't disintegrate. An evil person, like Paro, comes from the world of Tohu. They don't have the vessels of Tikkun. They don't have those vessels because if they did, they wouldn't be evil. The vessels, by definition, if it still exists, it means that it's striving for good. So because there's sparks of Tohu, what do? How do we overcome that? How do you overcome a Hitler? How do you overcome a Paro? How do you overcome a Haman? How do you overcome the sparks of Torah? Because they're a lot more stronger and more powerful than the sparks that we have right now. In other words, the sparks that we have in our neshama are so condensed and so modified in a way that they won't break the vessels. So technically, we are weaker than the sparks of Torah, which were so strong that it broke the vessels. So when Moshe saw Paro, there was a light of Moshe in the vessel of Tikkun, which is a lot weaker, is now up against sparks of Tohu, which are much more powerful. So Moshe was Ani Ar El Sosayim, I can't speak. I can't overcome. This is a greater spark. So what does Hashem do? Hashem says, now you are in charge. I gave you the power to draw down a light that's even higher than the sparks of Tohu. And now you're able to overcome Paro as well. Because now the sparks of Tohu cannot compete with what you have. In other words, because you are now a complete emissary of mine by saying the exact words that I'm telling you, you are now empowered to overcome even the misguided sparks of Torah, which are more powerful than your natural self. What does this mean in our lives? So let's go a little further, and then we're gonna break it down. So the Rebbe explains like this: what does it mean I've made you a lord over Paro? This verse is explained in the light of what's stated in another verse. You have an arm like God. This is from the verse of Eov, or known as Job, and it applies that no human can overcome a certain level of evil. That's why Yaakov had to bow down before Esau. You would think Yaakov is the holy person. He wasn't, but because Esau was the sparks of Tohu, and Yaakov was sparks of Tikkun in a vessel, there were times that Yaakov had to basically bow down to Esau because he knew that he could not compete with Esau's sparks. So that's the challenge Moshe was facing. The Rebbe goes on, what is behind this? Tzaddikim, the righteous, are from the world the Kabbalah calls Tikkun, order. Whereas Rashayim, the evil, are from a world of Tohu, which is chaos. This world of Tohu is greater than Tikkun and is animated by God's level of extreme kindness. In other words, this is an explanation of how sparks of Tohu are able to fuel and power evil, because it's sparks of kindness not in terms of acts of kindness, but flow. Kindness flows like liquid, like water, and it basically goes anywhere. That doesn't necessarily distinguish between good and evil, and therefore the evil are able to take a lot of energy from the sparks of Tohu. So because the sparks of Torah are a lot greater and higher, they're able to do a lot more bad than we are good. And that's why, like, Eov's challenge is like, you can't fight that. In other words, only Hashem could fight those sparks, to topple them while they're still peaking at their greatest strength. This then is what Hashem told Moshe, I have made you Lord over Paro. That Hashem tells Moshe that you now have godlike strength over Paro. Despite the fact that Paro is still feeding off of the sparks of Tohu, these high sparks of this world of Tohu, and Moshe is from Tikkun, which is technically weaker. But since Moshe was now empowered by Hashem to be his emissary, so nothing could stand in his way, even the sparks of Tohu. All right, so now let's get this. Let's go to the next one. Oh, actually, no, let's read. This is a good one. At this point of the game, Moshe is informed that Hashem's not only was he speech impaired, but it was non-existent. He couldn't speak because he can't overcome Tohu. So it's as if Moshe didn't exist at all entirely and utterly devoted to God alone. So how does he overcome that? It's because basically now it's not about his speech anymore, but it's about the fact that he's a pure emissary of Hashem. It's not about his ability to speak or ability to communicate. It's about the fact that he's an emissary. So every single thing he does, his movement, his anger, his body language, everything is communicating what Hashem wants to be communicated. And therefore he has the power now to break the sparks of Tohu. So the fact that Moshe was heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue, which was just a disability to prevent his clear speech, stemmed from tremendous subservience to Hashem, because he was completely insignificant before Hashem. He was unable to be communicative to a material audience. But it follows that the fact that Moshe was closed lips demonstrates an even greater level of subservience, a level of complete lack of self that made it impossible for him to even talk. So the first Torah portion, his disability was just the fact that he was devoted to Hashem, but he was still Moshe. But the second parsha, where he says, I can't even talk, he's basically saying, I'm now your total emissary. And because I'm your total emissary, Hashem says, you're now basically a lord. You're Elokim LeParo. You now have the ability to break the will of Paro. You are now a complete emissary of Hashem. You are not just Moshe in the world of Tikkun. It is specifically this intense degree lack of self that was preparatory step to the next stage of I've made you a lord over Paro. Because he became so nullified, as he was no longer in it for himself at all. There was no self-existence at all. He's now able to overcome whatever challenges he might face because he's basically the hand of Hashem. So how does Moshe merit this? Because Moshe's intense lack of self, in other words, he was the most humble of all people, a degree that wasn't, in other words, he wasn't even conscious of his own self whatsoever. He was able to be a conduit of Hashem's word in a manner that was necessary to crush Paro. And that's a very hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to overcome. But because he was so selfless and so nullified and so nothing, so Hashem was able to basically make him a complete emissary to the point that he had the ability to overcome the greatest challenge that had never been accomplished before, which is to break the wheel of Paro's dominance and slavery. So now let us draw this to us. We're not Moshe, right? We're not as humble as Moshe was, and we're not as selfless as Moshe was. But we have it within us, part of us. We have a part of Moshe within us. And when we're challenged, when we come to a point where we feel like there's no way that I can naturally outdo this thing or overcome this challenge that I'm facing, so first we have to get out of bed. That's last week. But we're done. We did that. We got out of bed. We realized that this is our mission. Hashem gave us the ability to overcome the challenges that we're facing. But now we realize the challenges are a lot bigger than we thought. We realize that what we have to do is much harder, more difficult, and has never been done before. In whatever aspect of life we're talking about right now, it could be anything. We all could draw this to wherever we want. But the bottom line is that when we plug in to the point that we realize it's not about us, even for a second, even for a moment, or even for one mitzvah, or whatever that might be, for that one moment, we're able to draw down a level of Moshe, a level of godliness, a level of selflessness, like Moshe, a level of godliness that made Moshe his emissary, and be able to crush even Paro that has never been done before at the time. The Alter Rebbe gives us an actual utility to how we're supposed to act this way. And I want to preface this text with a story of, I believe, Yitzchak Berditchev, that when he first went to study under the Maggid of Mezrich, so he went to study Chassidus, went to study how to, refine his character in the Chassidic movement. So when he came back to his hometown, they were all very skeptical of like, who's this, like he was such a big scholar. Why did he have to go to this, Maggid of Mezrich? His father-in-law was also very critical of his actions. However, the community still respected him. He was a big Torah scholar. So when it came time to, Simchas Torah, to recite the first Atar Reisa, they called him up. They call him up to the bima to say the Atar Reisa on Simchas Torah, and he gets up and he basically starts mumbling to himself, and he can't he's like talking to another person that doesn't exist. And he has this whole conversation, and no one could hear a word he's saying. Finally, he just screams at whatever imaginary figure's next to him. He's like, you know what? You say that, Paris. And he runs away. And later on, his father-in-law couldn't get over himself. Was like, who's this crazy son-in-law I had? Asked him what was going on. And he said, well, I got up to the bima, and lo and behold, it's not just me. It's my Yetzer Hara. It's my evil inclination. It's my negative self, a negative conscience is there, and it's basically proud that I'm being called up for the first Atar Reisa. And I scream at him and says, what are you doing here? You weren't called up, I was called up. And the Yetzer Hara answers me, says, what do you mean? You were called up, I'm called up too. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak says, what do you, just because I'm called doesn't give you permission to be up here. I, davened this morning. I studied Torah this morning. The Torah says, well, guess what? I was with you the whole time. I studied as well. I davened with you as well. And Rabbi Levi says, well, I went to the Maggid Mezrich and I studied how to daven and how to learn and how to connect myself to Hashem. And the Yetzer Hara said, well, guess what? I did all that too. Rabbi Yitzchak says, throws off his talis and he screams at the Yetzer Hara, says, you know what? So fine, so you say the Alter Rebbe. So now let's read this text and I'll explain the story. The Alter Rebbe writes, oops, 1 second. This is in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe writes, grow angry with your animal soul, your evil inclination, and thunder against it. And say in your mind, how long will you hide God's infinite light from me, denying the self-evident truth? This will help your godly soul see the truth of Hashem's endless unity with the clarity and sensory vision, and not just the power of deduction and logic. But for the Jewish people are believers, the children of believers. What the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that we should almost become schizophrenic. We should see a second person. When we have a negative thought, whether it's a negative thought against ourselves, whether it's whatever the thought is that we want to get rid of. When we have something that's trying to discourage us or disconnect us, we cannot treat it like it's a thought that belongs to us, because it doesn't. We are believers, the children of believers. We don't have such thoughts. If there is a thought like that, we have to treat it like it's another person, like it's an outsider. What are you doing here? And we have to scream at it by saying, your negative thoughts are preventing me from connecting with Hashem. Even though it's a thought that was generated by our own self, our own consciousness and our own existence, we should still treat it like it's an outsider and not give it the sense of comfort that it belongs with us. It doesn't. It's not part of us. Let's scream at it. What the Alter Rebbe is doing, and trust me, he knows who we are. He knows the Rebbeim knew who we are. But at the same time, we cannot get comfortable with the fact that there's a voice in our head that is saying such negative things. Even if we earned it, even if we let that voice in originally, we have to get angry at it and scream at it in the sense that you're not me. And that's what Rabbi Levi Yitzchak is demonstrating, that he was not allowing a negative force to be comfortable within himself. He is admitting that he has it. It's there, just like it is by everyone. But the difference between Rabbi Levi Yitzchak is that for us, we actually make that Yetzer Hara feel very comfortable and make it feel like it's really part of us, convince ourselves it's part of us, and convince ourselves that, well, we must be a bad person because the Yetzer Hara is telling us to do this or to think this. But Rabbi Levi Yitzchak is teaching us that we treat it like it's an outside and say, I'm not you, you're not me. Just because you're part of me doesn't mean you're not me. Doesn't mean you're me. And it's a whole new attitude. If you read many of these focus books or books on thought and how to control your thought, very often it instructs you to sort of speak to yourself in a way that you don't allow yourself to have this negative thoughts. But it actually originates from here, from a book that was written 300 years ago, telling us that we do not treat negative thoughts in our head as if it's part of us. It doesn't belong there. Even if we put it there or we thought it originally, it's not ours. It doesn't belong to us. Because everything that's in our brain is good. Everything that's in our soul is good. And if it's not good, it means that it's an outsider that just found its way in there. It doesn't belong there. We have to scream at it. All right, let's go to one more text. And this is why we were taught that every single soul has an element of Moshe, and that power, the ability to transcend and overcome the challenges that we face, and we can become completely subservient to Hashem. When we do that, then Hashem rewards us, even for a moment, with the feeling and the ability to overcome even a power that has never been overcome before. That is our lesson from Moshe this week, our lesson from Va'era, in this week's parasha. I want to thank you all for joining. And I want to thank you for being a part of Torah studies. And may you have a wonderful and restful and peaceful Shabbat.